Throughout the annals of human history, the prevailing view was that warfare was an exclusively male domain, with women being seen as ill-suited for the horrors and demands of battle. Nevertheless, the arrival of the 20th century signaled a profound shift, not only in the tides of time, but also in societal attitudes regarding women's involvement in military affairs. The presence of women and young girls within the ranks of various armed forces across the globe became a widespread phenomenon. They assumed a plethora of roles, such as operators of communication systems, nurses tending to the wounded, medical personnel, couriers ferrying crucial messages, among others. Moreover, in times of conflict, numerous women stepped forward to serve directly as military personnel. Regrettably, many of these brave souls were subjected to the grim reality of becoming prisoners of war. The stark and sobering narratives from the Second World War serve as a particularly poignant testament to this fact. On the one hand, the existence of international conventions for the humane treatment of prisoners of war and the active engagement of organizations like the Red Cross offered a glimmer of hope. On the other hand, the world bore witness to acts of such unspeakable barbarity that they challenged the bounds of comprehension, particularly when considering how the forces under Hitler's command meted out their cruelty to female prisoners of war, whether they were enlisted service members or valiant resistance fighters. In Europe, for instance, the archival records on the treatment of captured French, Polish, and even German women who opposed the fascist regime are sparse and incomplete. This dearth of information is principally attributable to the Nazi regime's efforts to obfuscate and conceal the full extent of their heinous acts, particularly from international observers, such as the representatives of the Red Cross. In the European theater, the treatment of female prisoners of war was shrouded in subterfuge, with many being dispatched to concentration camps under a veneer of legality. However, the core issue revolved around the definition of who qualified as a prisoner of war. While the status of a captured corporal from the Belgian army, for example, was clear-cut, the same could not be said for guerrilla fighters or members of the underground resistance. This ambiguity in legal status granted the German captors considerable leeway to impose their will upon their captives as they saw fit. There exists a multitude of harrowing accounts of women and young girls who vanished without a trace during guerrilla operations, particularly in places like Poland, their fates forever shrouded in mystery. It is feared that many may have been summarily executed, subjected to torture, or fallen victim to sexual violence. The harrowing experiences of those women who found themselves confined within the walls of Gestapo prisons or concentration camps provide us with a glimpse, albeit limited, into the nightmarish ordeals endured by those unfortunate enough to be captured by the Nazis. In the clandestine recesses of Gestapo cells, shielded from the public eye, women were subjected to tortures as cruel and inhumane as those inflicted upon men. They were violated, physically assaulted with rubber truncheons, branded with symbols seared into their flesh, mutilated, and subjected to a host of other unspeakable acts of brutality. The catalog of these tortures is extensive and chilling, ultimately culminating in the death penalty for those who did not perish under torture, executed by shooting, hanging, or decapitation via guillotine. As perverse as it may sound, these methods of execution were, in some twisted sense, the more merciful fates compared to others. The fate reserved for captured Jewish female resistance fighters was particularly ghastly. Some were immolated alive within the claustrophobic confines of the ghetto basements. Others were summarily executed with gunfire. Survivor testimonies recount how the Germans dispensed with all semblance of humanity when dealing with Jewish female combatants. Only the very fortunate were dispatched swiftly by gunshot. Others faced the frenzied wrath of soldiers who would resort to stabbing them with bayonets, slitting their throats, or beating them to death. This cruel destiny was not exclusive to Jewish fighters, but was also shared by Polish resistance fighters, Yugoslav partisans, and many others. In Yugoslavia, the treatment of captured Serbian women who had joined the resistance was particularly brutal, especially at the hands of the Croatian Ustasha. Aside from orchestrating mass and brutal sexual assaults, they devised horrific methods of torture and killing for these prisoners, displaying a sadistic creativity in the infliction of suffering. Reports surfaced of victims being bludgeoned, dismembered, and subjected to other macabre forms of execution at the hands of these fascist minions. Such atrocities periodically resurfaced during investigations into the genocide of the Serbs during the Second World War. The ordeal for women resistance fighters who were interned in concentration camps was equally appalling. They were subjected to beatings, lethal medical experiments, attacks by guard dogs, and incineration in crematoria. While it is not asserted that the Nazis devised specialized methods of execution specifically for female fighters in the camps, the fate of countless women, including nurses, medics, and communication specialists captured during the occupation of Soviet territories, was equally grim. Despite explicit orders to execute female military personnel on the spot, there were many instances where ordinary soldiers were reluctant to carry out such commands. However, documented cases reveal that captured women were frequently raped to death. If by some miracle the victims survived the assault, they were either shot or stabbed with bayonets. In the frigid winters, the Nazis would strip women naked and abandon them on the roadsides to succumb to the cold. There are also accounts of women being desecrated with knives or bayonets, carved with indecent inscriptions, and left to die from the ensuing blood loss. One of the most horrific episodes involved a 19-year-old Red Army servicewoman who was discovered posthumously with her eyes gouged out, breasts severed, and scalp completely shorn, a clear indication that she had endured a ghastly medieval-style execution while still alive. The executions of female snipers, whom the Nazis referred to as silent death, were especially egregious. One such hero of the Soviet Union, sniper Tatiana Baramzina, who had stayed behind to provide cover for her comrades, was captured after being grievously wounded. The Nazis subjected her to unspeakable tortures before ultimately executing her with an anti-tank rifle. In the village of Soglevka, there were eyewitness accounts of the execution of a wounded Red Army servicewoman. She was stripped bare, mutilated, and flung onto the snow to await an agonizing death from blood loss and hypothermia. The exact number of women who perished from torture within these walls remains unknown. The story of Zenaida Portnova, a 17-year-old who fought with a partisan unit, is particularly haunting. After being captured and subjected to unknown horrors in a Gestapo basement, she was led to her execution, having been rendered blind and her hair turned completely gray. Those female prisoners of war who were sent to prison camps faced the constant threat of death, a death that often came slowly and excruciatingly. One former prisoner of war recounted the arrival of a Red Army woman to the camp in Dragovich, whose subsequent fate was as horrific as it was cruel. Captain Stroyer, the camp commandant, attempted to violate her. When she resisted, the soldiers he summoned restrained her to a bed. In the barrack camp in Milarovo, which was designated for female military prisoners, police would routinely visit to select women for themselves and for the German soldiers. Any form of resistance from the women was met with brutal punishment, and outcries for mercy were strictly prohibited. Many succumbed to their suffering in utter agony, their cries echoing into the void of history.